Now we're going to talk about productivity and economic growth. In terms of establishing the reasons for long-term economic growth, whether it's high or low, productivity is by far the biggest factor. Take a look at this picture which shows real GDP growing over time, the blue line, and then potential GDP, this estimate of the trend, the long-term trend. And as you can see, it's growing over time. That's the good thing. It averages about 3.2%. We're focusing on that long-term trend in the red line, not so much the ups and downs. We'll come back to the ups and downs, but now this focuses on long-term growth. And what we'll see is that long-term growth, as I say, depends very much on productivity growth. The story of economic growth can be summarized kind of quickly in a few lines. We're going to have a framework. It's actually based on microeconomic considerations where real GDP, which we'll symbolize by Y, depends on or is a function of labor force, which is L, amount of capital in the economy, which is designated by K, and this idea, a new idea here, is technology, which is represented by T. We've looked at labor in the last discussion. As already, you could see that in the discussion of the long-term potential growth rate of employment. We've looked at K by looking at the amount of investment that takes place and describe that through the spending allocation model. The more investment, the more capital there will be. We'll look at that further in this lecture. And today we're also going to look at the role of technology in economic growth. First thing to think about when you look at productivity growth over time is to take a glance at what's happened over a long period of time. This is a kind of an amazing picture of what's happened in the last 300 years or so. It looks at productivity growth, and in particular labor productivity growth, the amount of goods and services the labor force can produce on average in an economy. That's where progress is going to come from, the fact that workers can produce more per hour of work. And as you can see, in the 1700s, there was virtually no productivity growth. Workers were no more productive in the 1780s than they were earlier in the century. Then productivity began to pick up. The growth rose in the Industrial Revolution. You had inventions, you had the building of factories and ways that workers would become more productive. It grew even further, and then further now, and now it's far above what it was then. And so the progress in the economy has to do with this increasing productivity or productivity growth. We want to try to describe this and bring it into the model. It's one thing to talk about it, it's one thing to bring it into a model. So the way we're going to bring it into a model is, perhaps not surprisingly, go to the basics of economics. And this is a picture that may seem familiar to some of you. It's a production function for one firm. It shows hours of work on the horizontal axis and the amount of production on the vertical axis. In this case, it could be pumpkins, it could be anything. But the important thing is here, the more hours of work, the more production. The quantity produced is larger. And it also has these diminishing returns. That curve gets flatter over time, so the marginal product is higher at low levels than it is at higher levels of labor input, and that's that diminishing product. So when we think about the whole economy, we want to try to aggregate this kind of production function for many firms. And so let's think about it in terms of a more systematic way. An aggregate production function, just by the name aggregate, represents a summing up of production by all the firms in the economy. So it's like an analogy, if you like. Y is a function of L. GDP is a function of labor input for a single firm and for the economy as a whole. For the economy as a whole, of course, Y is GDP. It's the average weighted sum of all of the production in the economy. And labor also we have to think of as an aggregate of all the different types of hours of work in the economy, weighted by skill or some way to make sure that you've got not have a problem of adding apples and oranges. More generally, we're going to think of a production function as not depending on just labor, but also capital. We've examined that before, whether we're looking at food services, hiring a food truck to help with the food services or whatever, that's capital. And then technology, of course. Y is GDP as I define, L is labor, K is capital, and now T is technology. There's examples of this, little kind of functional forms to help you think about this production function. So you could say real GDP is technology times the square root of labor times the square root of capital. That would be an example, a simple example of a production function. Or you could have y is t times L raised to the 0.7 power times k raised to the 0.3 power. Hey, that's an example too. So economists looking for ways to represent this aggregate production function, thinking carefully about the aggregation of individual firms in the economy. An important definition, a thing to emphasize, we talked about it already, is labor productivity. In these symbols, that's simply real GDP divided by the total amount of labor in the economy. So that's labor productivity. It's how much being produced by labor. There's also this concept of total factor productivity. It's like labor productivity, except it represents the productivity of not just labor, but also capital, labor and capital together. You can think of that idea by looking at this example of the production function over here. If you take, for example, this production function and divide both sides by the amount of labor in the economy, but also the amount of capital in the economy, so you divide both sides by that, then you'll have a measure that says T is equal to Y over L to the 0.5 times K to the 0.5. So you can see that this T is kind of a total factor productivity. It's not just Y divided by L, it's Y divided by L to the 0.5 times K to the 0.5. So sort of both factors are in the denominator. In that sense, it's total factor productivity. And increase in total factor productivity would be where Y increases even without any increases or increases in K. So that's total factor productivity. Let's consider our theory of productivity and economic growth in steps. We want to consider first a firm just has labor or an economy just has labor, and then one with labor and capital, and then one with three things, all three things together, labor, capital, and technology. We build it up this way, it's kind of an easier way to understand what's going on when we get to the end. This is a picture where an economy would just depend on the amount of labor input. And you can see you have labor input on the horizontal axis, output on the vertical axis. We have a production function. It looks exactly like the production function for a single firm, except we have added this up for the economy as a whole. This is now the whole economy, but it's got this special thing of only one factor, labor, as an example. And you see the diminishing returns as exists for a single firm. To illustrate one of the implications of diminishing returns, let's think about what the famous economist Malthus once wrote about an economy with diminishing returns to labor and nothing else except labor. He thought about this idea of a subsistence line for people. It's really what they needed to survive. If subsistence line can be represented on the same picture as we represented the production function, labor on the horizontal axis, output on the vertical axis. And that's what people need to live, if you like. And if there's more people in the economy, labor input will be higher. There's more people available to work, say on the farms. They'll need more output. And you could think of output as actually food output. Think of this as an agricultural economy. So the more labor it is, the more food output is required. What Malthus emphasized is that there's a tendency to move back towards that line. And this is kind of the pessimism sometimes of Malthus. He would argue if you were over in this direction where there was too little food, you're below the subsistence line, then people would tend to starve off, die, have fewer kids, and you'd move the population down and therefore labor input down. If you're on the other side here where there's an abundance of food or more food than people need to survive, then the reverse is going to happen. They maybe will live longer, their diseases will be less of a problem, or they'll decide to have more kids and move in that direction. So there's always this tendency to move towards the subsistence line, at least that's what Malthus argued. Now interestingly, if you combine that a subsistence line with a production function, you get this idea of a Malthusian equilibrium. And we can illustrate it in this picture pretty easily. You'll see there's an intersection of the production function because it has diminishing returns with this subsistence line. And Malthus argued that that intersection was an equilibrium because if you were to the right of that intersection, as we just argued, there'd be a tendency for the population to grow down. And of course, production would decline as population and labor input declined as well towards the intersection. On the other side, if you had a relatively speaking abundance of food production relative to subsistence, you would move in the other direction. So there's tendency to move towards this Malthusian equilibrium. It's a pessimistic equilibrium because people are just barely getting by. And of course, these back and forths between pestilence and disease versus relative prosperity are quite destabilizing. So it's a dismal picture. In fact, that's one of the reasons economics has sometimes been called the dismal science. The truth is, though, that's not the end of the picture. Many things happened since Malthus, and it's not nearly as dismal as one might think, given that picture. One reason, of course, is there's other factors of production, not just labor. And one of the big ones, of course, is capital. And so the capital stock can increase over time as long as people are investing. I think it's helpful to sort of visualize what's going on with capital as more investment takes place with a diagram like this. So this diagram has just a bar diagram. Over on the far left, you can see what capital might be at the end of what it was at the end of last year, let's suppose $10 trillion in the economy. And then there's new investment during the year. Let's assume that's $1.5 trillion. Some of that new investment is replacing worn out capital that's not functioning anymore. That's depreciation. Let's assume that's $1 trillion. So what's left over in terms of net investment is $0.5 trillion, $0.5 trillion. So that $0.5 trillion is added to the capital that existed at the end of last year, and it gives you what the capital will be at the end of this year. And that's $10.5 trillion. So that little green block that's added to the top of the building is the increase in capital, and that, of course, is net investment. So over time, as long as the economy is investing, capital will grow, and that will be a source of growth. And so we want to bring that capital into our picture of long-term growth. And we do that, as you might suspect, by considering an economy with both labor and capital. Let's call it labor and capital alone because we're not yet including technology. On the horizontal axis, you have labor input as usual, and vertical axis, you have output. And now we're illustrating what happens with more capital. The production function, which we started with, you could think of that has relatively little capital. And then you can imagine there's an increase in capital, and that means you can produce more at any given amount of labor input. So that's more capital going up as the curve shifts up. Also, as the curve shifts up, you can sort of illustrate that by imagining your labor input is there, and with less capital, you're producing this amount. With more capital, you're producing that amount. So it's another way to represent the upward shift in the curve, the fact that at any given level of labor input, you're producing more. And so this actually changes the Malthusian dismal picture quite a bit. You can illustrate that in this diagram. Obviously, it's a happy picture for most people, including economists. It means their science is not so dismal. But more importantly, if you look carefully at the picture, we now see, again, the subsistence line again, just as drawn before. We see, say, the original production function designated as less capital. And now we have this new production function, which represents the shift upward with more capital. It's a production function that builds in more capital. And now it's possible to have more labor input as the population grows, but actually to get higher productivity. You see, your output is increasing by more than the labor input, so you're going above that subsistence line. And in this case, it's not nearly as pessimistic because you don't have to be drawn back to that subsistence line. People can actually improve their well-being above the bare minimum. And that's because of capital being able to raise the amount of production, even with diminishing returns to labor. However, this is not the happiest story because eventually there'll be diminishing returns to capital too. Let's not forget that all factors of production have these diminishing returns problem. You can illustrate diminishing returns problem with the same kind of a picture. And so as indicated here, capital also has diminishing returns. And so growth would not continue with capital and labor alone. You need something else. That's the point. You need something else, and that's going to be the technology. The picture, I think, illustrates that pretty well. The shift from the production function with 1 unit of capital to 2 units of capital raises the production function up. When you go from 2 to 3, it raises it up too, but by not as much. When you go from 3 units to 4 units, it increases again, but not by as much. So eventually it stops increasing. That's the diminishing returns to capital in this case. Those shifts up smaller amount. And so ultimately, the story of economic growth, which is that tremendous rise of standards of living over the last 300 years, you can see with the labor productivity bar chart at the beginning, or the growth of the US economy over the last 50 or 60 years, couldn't be explained just with labor and capital. You need technology, and that's what we're going to consider next. Thank you.